News. It was 9 years ago today when 19-year-old Jason Jolkowski walked from his home to catch a ride to work. He has not been seen since. That was 9 years now of hopeful searching for the Jolkowski family. They have a new picture here. It was generated with age progression technology.
Some people might stop searching, but that's not us. We're never going to give up. So no matter how long it is, we're always going to continue to be creative and find new ways to get the word out about him.
Answers, no clues, just the reminder that it's been 20 years and no one knows what happened to Jason Jolkowski.
There's no leads, and the detectives just didn't find anything, so there's no way of knowing.
That's Donnie to say. She was 16 when her 19-year-old cousin disappeared. June 13th marks 20 years since Jolkowski was unexpectedly called into work and agreed to meet his coworker at Benson High School for a ride.
Last seen taking the trash cans into his house, and a neighbor saw him do that, and then his brother also looked out the window and saw him walking in the direction towards Benson, and he was never seen or heard from again.
I didn't realize it's been 20 years.
June 13, 2001, late morning in Omaha, Nebraska. Jason Jolkowski leaves his family home expecting to walk a few blocks through his neighborhood before heading to work. Before leaving, he helps move the trash cans in from the curb. A neighbor sees him outside briefly. Nothing about the moment appears unusual. It is broad daylight, quiet residential streets, people nearby moving through ordinary routines. Jason is supposed to meet a coworker near Benson High School. He never arrives. Minutes later, the coworker calls Jason's house asking where he is. And almost immediately, the situation stops making sense. Because somewhere between Jason's front yard and the school parking lot, the timeline simply stops accounting for where he went next. No confirmed witness ever sees him leave the neighborhood. No physical evidence explains what interrupted the walk. No clear sign of violence is ever discovered. And more than 2 decades later, the most disturbing part of the case is still how little distance existed between ordinary life and complete disappearance. A few blocks. Late morning. A familiar neighborhood. The kind of place where people assume someone would notice if anything went wrong. But Jason Jolkowski disappeared inside an environment built around visibility, and no one has ever been able to clearly identify the moment where an ordinary walk through Omaha stopped being ordinary at all. Before Jason Jolkowski disappeared during a short walk through his own neighborhood, almost everything about his life appeared ordinary to the people around him. He was 19 years old and living with his family in northwest Omaha near the Benson area, in the same neighborhood where he had spent most of his life. Friends and relatives described him as quiet, polite, and somewhat shy around people he did not know well. Not isolated, just reserved. He loved baseball, followed the Chicago Cubs closely, collected sports cards, and spent time listening to music or working on small routines that made up everyday life at home. Jason worked part-time at a Fazoli's restaurant while preparing to begin a new job opportunity that family members later said he seemed genuinely excited about. For people close to him, nothing suggested someone planning to disappear voluntarily. His life still appeared connected to the future. Work, family, plans already in motion. And in many ways, Jason's routines reflected that stability. He helped around the house without being asked, spent time with his younger brother, stayed close to familiar places and predictable habits. That familiarity would later become one of the most psychologically unsettling aspects of the entire case. Because Jason did not disappear while traveling somewhere dangerous or unknown. He vanished inside the same residential neighborhood he had walked through for years. The area around Pinckney Street was quiet and densely ordinary. Small homes, tree-lined streets, people outside during the day, neighbors who recognized one another in passing. The kind of environment where movement normally remains visible simply because everyday life happens close together. And on the morning Jason disappeared, nothing initially appeared out of place. He was simply planning to walk a short distance through the neighborhood to meet a coworker for a ride to work because his own car was temporarily unavailable. A familiar route, broad daylight, only a few blocks from home. No visible conflict, no sign of panic. No obvious reason for anyone nearby to remember the morning as unusual while it was happening. And perhaps that is part of what continues making Jason Jolkowski's disappearance feel so difficult to process, even decades later. Because somewhere inside an environment built almost entirely around routine, visibility, and familiarity, the continuity of one person's life simply stopped accounting for where he went next. The morning of June 13, 2001, began normally inside the Jolkowski home in northwest Omaha. Jason had been called into work early at the Fazoli's near 81st and Cass Street, more than 4 miles from the house. His car was still being repaired at a local shop, so at first he considered walking farther to arrange transportation. Eventually, he called a coworker, and the two agreed to meet near Benson High School, a familiar location only a few blocks from Jason's neighborhood. The plan itself was simple. Jason would walk to the school, the coworker would pick him up there. Then they would drive to work together. Shortly before leaving, Jason changed into black dress pants and a white Chicago Cubs t-shirt, possibly featuring Sammy Sosa on the front. He wore black shoes and a blue Cubs cap and carried his red Fazoli's work shirt with him. He took very little else. No packed bag, no important personal belongings, only a small amount of cash. At approximately 10:45 a.m., Jason stepped outside. Before leaving, he helped his younger brother Michael move the trash bins back toward the garage after collection that morning. A neighbor across the street briefly saw the interaction and waved to Jason. That became the final confirmed sighting of him. From there, Jason was expected to walk roughly 8 blocks to Benson High School, a route that should have taken no more than 10 or 15 minutes. He never arrived. Around 11:15 a.m., Jason's coworker reached the school parking lot and waited. Jason did not appear. Several minutes later, the coworker called the Jolkowski house asking where he was. The question immediately unsettled the family. Jason was reliable, quiet and reserved, but dependable. If he said he would be somewhere, he normally arrived on time. As concern grew, police were contacted, and officers quickly began checking the area around Benson High School. Security cameras near the school showed no sign of Jason ever reaching the property. No confirmed witness reported seeing him continue along the route after he left home. No signs of a struggle were discovered along nearby streets or sidewalks. No belongings were recovered. And almost immediately, investigators encountered the contradiction that would come to define the entire case. How does someone disappear during late morning hours while walking a short, familiar route through a residential neighborhood filled with houses, parked cars, and people nearby? As search efforts expanded that afternoon, officers interviewed neighbors, searched surrounding streets, and brought in tracking dogs. Very little emerged. The timeline remained remarkably small. A short walk in broad daylight. Only a few unnoticed minutes between home and the school parking lot. And somewhere inside that ordinary stretch of neighborhood streets, the continuity of Jason Jolkowski's life disappears completely. By the afternoon of June 13, 2001, investigators were already confronting a disappearance that made very little sense structurally. Jason Jolkowski had vanished during late morning hours while walking a short distance through a residential Omaha neighborhood in broad daylight. And almost immediately, the investigation encountered a problem that would persist for decades. There was no clear point where the ordinary timeline visibly broke apart. Police began searching the Benson neighborhood within hours after Jason failed to arrive at Benson High School. Officers canvassed nearby streets, knocked on doors, interviewed residents, and searched the route Jason was expected to walk that morning. Canine units were brought into the area. Search efforts expanded through alleys, nearby properties, and surrounding blocks. Very little emerged. No confirmed witness reported seeing Jason after he left home. No physical evidence established where he went. No signs of a struggle were discovered along the route. Investigators quickly focused on the people connected to Jason's final known plans that morning, including the coworker who had agreed to pick him up near the school.
Last seen taking the trash cans into his house, and a neighbor saw him do that, and then his brother also looked out the window and saw him walking in the direction towards Benson, and he was never seen or heard from again.
His account remained consistent throughout questioning. Phone records and timeline details aligned with the known sequence of events, and investigators found no evidence directly connecting him to Jason's disappearance. Attention gradually widened toward other acquaintances,
There's a tree at Roberts
neighbors,
Park planted off
former
the Keystone
classmates,
Trail in honor
and
of
individuals
Jolkowski.
who may have
Sunday
crossed
afternoon,
paths
friends,
with Jason
families,
that
and
morning.
neighbors gathered to share
Again,
memories,
very
paint
little
and hide
developed,
rocks with the hashtag
and that absence became one of the most difficult parts of the case to interpret, because the timeline itself remained remarkably narrow. Jason was last seen around 10:45 a.m. He should have reached Benson High School within approximately 10 to 15 minutes. Somewhere inside that short window, something interrupted the normal progression of events strongly enough that Jason was never reliably seen again. As days turned into weeks, additional details deepened investigators' concern that the disappearance did not fit the pattern of a voluntary departure. Jason's bank account remained untouched. His paycheck was never collected. His vehicle stayed at the repair shop. Family members reported no indication that he planned to leave home or separate himself from the routines surrounding his life. The FBI later became involved, classifying the case as a possible non-family abduction. Searches expanded beyond the immediate neighborhood into parks, abandoned structures, and landfill areas connected to Omaha. Tips continued arriving over the years, but none produced a confirmed explanation for what happened during Jason's walk that morning. And over time, the investigation became defined less by discovered evidence than by the absence of it. No verified sightings, no recovered belongings, no forensic evidence clearly establishing where Jason went after leaving the neighborhood. At the same time, Jason's family continued pushing to keep public attention focused on the case. His mother, Kelly Jolkowski, later founded Project Jason, a nonprofit organization supporting families dealing with disappearances and missing persons investigations. The family also advocated for improvements in missing persons reporting systems in Nebraska following Jason's disappearance. But despite years of investigation, the central contradiction has never changed. A young man leaves home during late morning hours to walk a familiar route through a populated neighborhood. Minutes later, the timeline stops accounting for where he went next. And more than 2 decades later, investigators still cannot clearly establish what interrupted those final, ordinary minutes between Jason's front yard and Benson High School.
More news. It was 9 years ago today when 19-year-old Jason Jolkowski walked from his home to catch a ride to work. He has not been seen since. That was 9 years now of hopeful searching for the Jolkowski family. They have a new picture here. It was generated with age progression technology depicting what Jolkowski might look like today. His mother is placing posters around town. Kelly's also putting signs up in her lawn, on her lawn, and her goal is to develop a new lead concerning the whereabouts of her son. Along with the picture, she wants anyone with information to come forward. Kelly vows to continue searching until her son is found.
Some people might stop searching, but that's not us. We're never going to give up. So no matter how long it is, we're always going to continue to be creative and find new ways to get the word out about him.
And again, here is a look at the new aged picture. The Jolkowski family has set up Project Jason to help find Jason and other missing persons. The poster with the updated poster can be found on WOWT.com.
As the years passed without physical evidence, the disappearance of Jason Jolkowski gradually became a case defined almost entirely by competing possibilities. Because no single theory has ever fully explained how someone vanishes during a short daytime walk through a residential neighborhood without creating a clearer disturbance around the event itself. The theory investigators have generally treated most seriously is the possibility of an opportunistic abduction. Jason disappeared during a very small window of time. The route between his home and Benson High School was short enough that any interruption likely happened quickly, and for many people following the case, that detail remains psychologically important, because broad daylight creates an assumption of visibility. People tend to believe that if something dangerous happens during late morning hours in a neighborhood filled with houses and nearby traffic, someone will notice it immediately. But Jason's disappearance seems to challenge that assumption entirely. Some investigators and observers believe Jason may have encountered someone he recognized, or at least someone who appeared familiar or non-threatening enough for him to briefly stop walking. That possibility becomes important because there were no confirmed signs of panic, no reported scream, no obvious struggle, no witnesses describing a chaotic confrontation in the street, which raises a difficult question. If something happened to Jason, did it begin in a way that initially looked completely ordinary to anyone nearby? A short conversation, someone asking for help, an offer of a ride, a familiar face stopping beside the curb for only a few seconds, the kind of interaction most people would never remember afterward unless they already knew it mattered. At the same time, the case has also generated speculation involving someone familiar with Jason's routines or neighborhood. Not because investigators publicly identified a clear suspect, but because of how compressed the timeline remained. Whoever interacted with Jason, if anyone did, would likely have had only minutes before he was expected at Benson High School. That narrow window has led some observers to wonder whether the interruption was highly situational rather than random. Not necessarily a carefully planned event, but perhaps an unexpected encounter that escalated quickly enough to remove Jason from the visible timeline before anyone realized something was wrong. Others continue considering the possibility that Jason voluntarily entered a vehicle for reasons investigators were never able to reconstruct afterward. But even that theory struggles against the known details. The following is a short video analyzing the entire sequence of events.
Hello everyone, this is a video to diagram the disappearance of Jason Jolkowski. This is, believe the second episode Unfound ever did. His mother Kelly was my guest, and we talked about his disappearance. And I have to admit that I do not like to put superlatives on disappearances. Superlatives like you do in high school for senior, class clown, most likely to succeed, or those are what superlatives are. But I have to say this has to be one of Unfound's most befuddling cases that we've covered. I think I can admit that. So what you're looking at here is up here. Let me see if I can use my pencil again. Sure, I can. This is approximately where Jason and his family were living at the time, near the intersection of, this is Bedford Avenue right here, and this is 48th Street going up and down, and once again, Bedford going east and west. And they lived right here in this area. You can see that this is where he was approximately living, and this is the school down here on the bottom left-hand side where he was to meet a coworker who was picking him up, and they would go to work together. I'm not sure exactly where. I think it was a female coworker. I'm not sure where she was parked. This looks like a pretty big campus here, but this is the approximate area. And you can see here that the walking time, and that's what Jason was doing that day, 14 minutes, and it says there 0.6 miles, so just over a half mile. Not far at all. In fact, given where I live, that I can look out on the elevator landing looking east from where I live, and you can easily see over a half mile. It's not far at all. So he wasn't walking that far, and still something happened between here and here. What I think is noteworthy is that a neighbor saw him taking the trash can back into his house at approximately 10:45 a.m. And that was the last time that we know of anybody who saw him, anybody that's been tracked down all these years, almost 20 years later. And I think that makes sense because 10:45, if it's a 14-minute walk, it would make sense then that maybe they were scheduled to meet here at 11 o'clock. So he takes in the trash at 10:45. Roughly 15 minutes later, he's there at the school at 11 o'clock, right on time. They go to work. I think this also makes sense is because if you look at reports, and we talked about this in the episode as well, when he didn't show up, it's sometime between 11:15 and 11:30, this coworker went to the closest place she could find to find a payphone to call. I think it was her work, to say that Jason never showed up. It is my belief that she didn't have his home phone number. 2001, some people had cell phones, but it does not sound like this coworker had one, and I don't think that Jason had one either. So she had to rely on the old-fashioned technology, go drive somewhere, find a payphone, or maybe if it was a gas station or something, they just let him use a regular phone to call work and say, hey, I might be late, Jason hasn't showed up, can you call? And of course, nobody answered when a phone call was made to the Jolkowski home. And that's how this disappearance got started. Somewhere between here and here, somewhere in here, something happened. Now, I'm not going to get into it here, but I have my own ideas about what happened. My best guess. I've written about it in the first Unfound book, if you'd like to get that on Amazon in either print or ebook form. Well, the reason I call this disappearance befuddling is because we talk a lot about people who have walked away, people who are walking places and didn't get there, but usually these people, to be frank, sometimes, they're in a bad relationship. Maybe it's a woman walking somewhere and we believe maybe her husband or boyfriend did something to her. It makes total sense. Some of these people are into drugs, into criminal activity, and so maybe it makes more sense that something bad happened along the way. Whereas Jason, of course, wasn't into any of that. He was 19 years old, living at home, living a good life, making good choices, his education and everything else. And somewhere in here, he disappeared. I will say this. I do believe that somebody he knew picked him up, somebody who he trusted. I've had a chance to think about this a lot. I've talked to some of my assistants about it. And no matter how many times I try to look at it from a different point of view, I keep coming back to the idea that somebody he trusted happened upon him while he was walking from point A to point B, and this person convinced him to get in the car, maybe coworker over at the high school, and this person said, "Hey, don't worry about that. Get in with me. I'll take you to work." This makes a lot of sense. Because what doesn't make sense is, given that Jason was 19 years old, he was a bigger kid, over 6 feet tall, would not have been the type of person that a criminal would pick out to mug or abduct or anything like that. I think that it was somebody that Jason trusted. We have to remember that he did have some learning disability, and his mother explained that maybe he was too trusting of people. That could have played a part in what happened here. But I've convinced myself that it was somebody who knew Jason that just happened upon him that day and picked him up, and something happened.
Jason left behind nearly everything associated with long-term departure. His paycheck remained untouched. His bank activity stopped completely. Family members reported no indication he intended to separate himself from his life, routines, or future plans. And over time, another aspect of the case became increasingly difficult for investigators to ignore: the complete absence of reliable sightings after Jason left home. Many missing persons investigations eventually produce fragmented reports, disputed encounters, or partial traces suggesting movement after the disappearance. Jason's case produced remarkably little. No confirmed activity tied to him after that morning. No credible evidence placing him somewhere else later in the day. No reliable indication that he successfully left the neighborhood at all. It is almost as though the timeline narrows sharply and then stops. That absence has contributed to the enduring perception that whatever happened likely occurred very close to the original route between the house and Benson High School. And perhaps that is what keeps the case psychologically unsettled even now. Because most disappearances still contain movement. A person travels somewhere, contacts someone, leaves behind fragments that allow investigators to continue extending the timeline outward. Jason's case behaves differently. The timeline contracts instead of expanding. It becomes smaller, shorter, more compressed, until eventually the entire mystery seems to center around only a few unnoticed minutes inside one ordinary neighborhood in Omaha. But even after decades, no theory resolves every contradiction cleanly. A random abduction raises questions about risk and visibility in broad daylight. A targeted encounter requires circumstances investigators were never able to conclusively establish. And voluntary disappearance conflicts with nearly every known pattern surrounding Jason's life before he vanished. Which means the central problem of the case has never really changed. Not simply that Jason Jolkowski disappeared, but that the disappearance occurred inside an environment where people instinctively believe visibility should have protected him from vanishing so completely. A short walk, late morning, residential streets, people nearby. And somewhere inside those ordinary minutes, the timeline stops explaining what happened next. What continues to make Jason Jolkowski's disappearance feel unusually difficult to process is not simply that he vanished. It is how little disruption the event appears to have created around itself. Most disappearances leave behind some visible transition point, a final phone call, a vehicle abandoned somewhere unexpected, a witness describing panic, confusion, or conflict. Some identifiable point where ordinary life visibly begins separating from explanation. But in Jason's case, that rupture never clearly appears. Instead, the timeline narrows into an ordinary daytime walk through a familiar neighborhood, and then stops. That absence creates a psychological gap investigators have never been able to fully close, because Jason did not disappear while isolated from other people. He vanished during late morning hours in a residential area filled with houses, parked cars, nearby intersections, and people moving through ordinary routines. The route itself was short, simple, familiar enough that nobody around him would have considered it dangerous. And perhaps that is what continues making the case feel so psychologically unsettled even decades later. There is no clear point where the environment around Jason visibly changes from safe to threatening. No obvious moment where the situation announces itself as abnormal, which means whatever interrupted the timeline may initially have looked completely ordinary to anyone nearby. A brief interaction, a stopped vehicle, a conversation lasting only seconds, something small enough that the surrounding neighborhood simply absorbed it into the background of an otherwise normal morning. And once those minutes passed, the opportunity to clearly reconstruct them may have disappeared with them. That possibility changes the emotional structure of the case entirely, because the unresolved tension surrounding Jason's disappearance does not come from complexity. It comes from simplicity. A young man leaves home, walks a few blocks toward a familiar meeting point, never arrives. No verified sightings afterward. No confirmed evidence explaining where the route changed direction. No clear indication of how the disappearance unfolded without attracting attention. And more than 2 decades later, that narrow missing window between Jason's front yard and Benson High School remains psychologically difficult to resolve for one reason above all others. It still feels like a place where someone should have seen something. Jason Jolkowski's disappearance remains officially unsolved. More than 2 decades after he vanished while walking through his own neighborhood, no verified trace of him has ever been recovered. No one has ever been charged. And investigators still cannot clearly establish what happened during the short period of time between Jason leaving home and failing to arrive at Benson High School. The case remains active with Omaha police, and age-progressed images of Jason continue circulating publicly in the hope that someone may eventually come forward with information capable of reconnecting the missing portion of the timeline. At the same time, Jason's disappearance continued shaping lives far beyond the investigation itself. His mother, Kelly Jolkowski, transformed the experience into advocacy work for missing persons and their families through Project Jason, an organization created to support people navigating the uncertainty and procedural confusion surrounding disappearances. In many ways, that response reflects something important about why Jason's case continues affecting people so deeply, even now. Because unlike disappearances associated with obvious danger, isolation, or chaos, Jason vanished from the middle of ordinary life, a quiet neighborhood, late morning sunlight, people nearby continuing through familiar routines, the kind of environment most people instinctively associate with safety through visibility. And yet somewhere inside a walk that should have lasted only minutes, the continuity of one person's life disappeared without leaving behind a clear explanation for where the story changed direction. That contradiction remains psychologically difficult to resolve because it challenges a comforting assumption people rarely think about directly, that if something serious happens nearby, someone will notice it clearly while it is happening. But Jason Jolkowski's disappearance suggests something far more unsettling. Sometimes the critical moment passes quietly enough that the world around it continues moving normally for hours before anyone realizes the timeline has already broken apart. And maybe that is why the case continues lingering in public memory decades later, not simply because Jason disappeared, but because the disappearance happened in a place where people still struggle to understand how disappearing should have been possible at all. If you followed the case all the way through, what theory makes the most sense to you? And after everything investigators still cannot explain, what do you think happened during those final unnoticed minutes between Jason's front yard and Benson High School?